So Ken Mehlman, with whom I am quite familiar, partner in charge of KKR's Global Public Affairs, a co-founder of the Impact Fund, which I want to talk a lot about today. Veteran of U.S. politics and the last Republican presidential campaign manager to actually win more than 50% of the vote, which is pretty cool. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention amazing uncle, great brother, awesome son. Welcome to Wayne's World Meets Meet the Press.
Thank you for the opportunity. And today is an important day for a lot of reasons, including your birthday. So everyone ought to join me in wishing Bruce Mehlman a happy birthday.
Nobody needs to come off camera or microphone to do that, but thank you. I appreciate that. I would note, by the way, that you may be testing, based upon registrations, you may be testing attendance in contrast with Admiral McRaven, and he got bin Laden.
Wow.
You got John Kerry when he was for it before he was against it, but otherwise the Mehlman's military service. The Admiral talked about the need to run toward the guns, and I feel like we've always been a he who fights and runs away kind of family. But that's not what we're here to talk about. So I'm hoping we're going to have all the fun of the Cuomo brothers with less drama, perhaps. I'm of course totally biased, but I think all the stuff that you've been doing, past, present, and as we've discussed, future ideas is really interesting, and particularly as you think about ways to have impact. So let's just dive in. Let's start with some of your career. You had a pretty extraordinary rocket ship of a political career where you were White House political director at age 35. You then ran a winning presidential campaign at 38. You became the party chair at 40. And then you dropped the mic and you moved to New York City and you shift to KKR. But at the top of your game, you walk away from this town and from politics. Why?
Well, first, thanks for inviting me. And I really am privileged by the opportunities I was able to get really early in my career. Got to work with some amazing people. I see Kevin Madden, Leslie Westeen, so many others that helped enable those successes. But at the end of the day, at least everyone's built differently. The way I'm built is my roots grow the most when they have access to new soil. And I felt like I was in a place where there was content I had built from my time in politics, whether it be around crisis management, understanding the political and policy process, whether it be overseeing an operation where there were 2,000 people that worked. Those were all things I felt like I knew, and I wanted to find new soil where I could apply them. I knew Henry Kravis, I knew George Roberts, there was another gentleman here named Mark Lipschultz, and I had a conversation with them, and I said to them, I have a thesis for you. And the thesis is the same way that KKR has built out an ability to help make better investments and to make our companies more valuable through experts on areas like operational improvement or M&A or helping our companies with talent management. I think policy fluency, crisis management, and stakeholder engagement can be real valuable as we think about where to invest and ultimately how to create value in our companies and de-risk them. And they said, we agree. And 15 years later, I'm still doing it. So that's kind of how I thought about it. I loved what I did in politics, but again, I'm my best when I'm learning something new, climbing a new hill, and this was an opportunity to contribute in that way.
All right, so maybe that explains then the same next kind of unexpected leap, which is you're brought into the KKR. Not only do you defend the castle, but you help them and all of the companies in which they invest think about policy fluency and government as a stakeholder and how to be more engaged. And you're doing that great. You start the Global Institute with General Petraeus, which I'll ask you about in a minute. And you're on all these NGO nonprofit boards. I know how busy you are. So that's when you decide I should start an impact fund with all of the fundraising and all of the work that entails. Was this a Rolling Stone moment? Did you see this as an obvious continuation? Like why would the busiest guy I know decide to make himself twice as busy?
Well, look, I think at the end of the day, it comes down to the same answer to your first question. If you stop and think about what's the content you have, what's the content you possess as a person? What do you know? What do you understand? And what can you contribute? And where are different places you can put it to work? And what my partner, Robert Antablin, who started the fund along with me, and I saw was that there was a lot of opportunities in the middle market to invest in companies around themes where KKR had historically invested, whether it be the energy transition or energy efficiency or workforce development, or companies that would help with circularity so that there could be less waste generated. We saw more and more opportunities in this space, and yet we didn't have the capital as investors to put it to work because our funds had gotten too big. And what every one of the themes I just described had in common was that it wasn't just solving a business problem, it was solving a structural problem in society. Like there aren't enough workers, so you need more vocational training. Or you're spending a ton of money because your energy costs are too high when you could have energy efficiency that could improve your bottom line and also reduce emissions. And so we saw this Venn diagram between business solutions and structural solutions. And we said, why don't we create a business, the Global Impact Fund, that in my case would take what I knew about policy and about where the world was heading and what Robert knew as a private equity investor. Let's join forces and let's put our minds to work in a way that builds a strategy. And that's how we thought about it. So again, it's another example of, to me, the most important thing in life is not what have you done or what's your job. It's what's the content you have. What do you understand? And what are places that people might not expect you can put it to work to contribute to whatever organization you're part of.
All right. So you start an impact fund. As we know, so two things. One, I'm interested in how it's going, but also we know that there is now among conservatives a backlash against what many think is business leaders getting out of their lane, whether it's an ESG or impact, thinking that they are hired by shareholders to solve global problems as opposed to maximize return on investment. The old Milton Friedman admonition that that's the primary role of business in society. Does impact investing mean surrendering return?
It does not at all. Our impact strategy is a Friedman first strategy. So our impact strategy is focused on doing exactly what Milton Friedman said, which is maximizing returns. In fact, if you were watching in February, our most recent quarterly reporting, which was through the end of last year, through the last quarter, I'm pretty proud that the impact strategy at KKR is our highest performing strategy across the firm. So we're 30+% gross IRR. And the reason is we're solving really big—
Your math SATs did not predict that, by the way.
We're solving really big structural problems. So again, let me give you one example. If anybody on this call receives e-commerce or sends e-commerce, one of the challenges that a company like Amazon or Walmart faces is that because of the standardized packaging, they have these big boxes with a small product inside, which means Amazon and Walmart and others are essentially paying planes to ship air because most of the box is empty and it's mostly filled with filler, which you have to chop down trees for. We have a company that uses 3D printing that actually customizes the box to the exact size of the product. That's a business solution. You're solving a business pain point. It also, last year, 130 million metric tons of cardboard was saved, which is good from all kinds of environmental metrics. So the question is, where can you find these opportunities? And if that's how you look about it, which is business first, you don't end up where I think some critics rightly raise questions, which is, are you putting your investors first? Everything we do in the sustainability space is fundamentally about value creation or value protection. And our strategy is first and foremost about finding business solutions to business pain points that also coincide with a structural challenge associated with United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And that's how we think about it.
All right. So that makes sense. Obviously, there is an unlimited supply of both business challenges and global challenges, and you guys aren't looking to boil the ocean. So do you have does the Impact Fund have an investment thesis, or how do you narrow the potential targets to vet?
Yeah, so there are 4 big areas we're focused on. And this is after we make the judgment that this company, we believe, will perform the way a traditional private equity company would perform. One is the energy transition and climate action. So an example of an investment in that space, we recently made an investment in Europe's the largest e-bike business called Excel. So people that will take an e-bike or an e-scooter to work, we have the data that shows it, much less likely to drive to work or take public transport to work. And we can demonstrate with data what the impact is when it comes to, for example, emissions. That's a solution to a real problem. We've made an energy efficiency investment. That's a solution to a real problem. The second is what you might consider sustainable living or circularity. And an example of that is the example I gave of the packaging, sustainable packaging company. It's how do you change operations in a way that essentially reduces the waste that's generated, reduces the forest products that are used in it, that optimizes that. The third and the biggest area we've invested is workforce development and lifelong learning. 2 big areas we focused. One is investing in companies that are building the data analytics necessary to understand what are the skills people are likely to need for the jobs of the future. And then two, what are the platforms by which we train people? Vocational training. We have the largest vocational training platform in Europe. Good example of the problem, Spain. Spain has a higher than average for the EU number of people who have a college degree and a higher than average number of unemployed people, particularly among young people. What's the problem? That before our business that we built called Master D, there was really a very small and in no way scaled way for people across Spain to be able to develop skills in the areas of the jobs necessary for the future. For example, to be nurses, to be technicians, to do health IT, things like that. We're building that at scale. And then the last area of focus is what we call inclusive growth. And that is what's happening all around the world, as we know, particularly in Asia, is a rising middle class. And so how do you allow that rising middle class to be served by solutions that are available to us today, but aren't available there? We have a really interesting business, for example, that is in the financial inclusion space. Today in India, if you operate a small business, in most contexts, your ability to borrow money at anything other than ridiculously high interest rates is limited. Our platform offers an alternative. And so the result of each of these areas is we're solving first and foremost a structural solution, whether it be to business, whether it be to small business, whether it be to customers, and we're solving via the Venn diagram a societal problem, whether it be environmental, whether it be workforce. And as a result, we're able to find these opportunities.
So what do you make of the ESG wars then? The fact that, you know, did the pro ESG side lean too far over the skis? Are the folks who are against it calling it a four-letter word, kind of losing their minds? I mean, how do you see this impacting both politics and the market?
I think it's legitimate questions. Like, I think it is legitimate to ask two big questions. One, if you're an investor, so at KKR, if you look across everything we do, we invest on behalf of people like the fire and the police in New York, the teachers here, the teachers of Texas. There are 20 million people who made a decision in life that they're not going to maximize their own financial returns. Instead, they're going to do public service. And we have a responsibility because the pension funds that help them get a good pension invest with us. So we must maximize returns for those people. I actually think that's a pretty important social objective. And that has to be our objective. And I think to make sure that investors across the board do that is critically important. Also, it's legitimate to say, are people greenwashing? So if you have a business that fundamentally is operating in a misaligned way, a business, for example, that has a lot of data that isn't securing that data when it comes to privacy questions, a business that's in the manufacturing space that isn't operating in a way with a good safety record, and then they brag about being net zero or they brag about diversity, to me, that's greenwashing. They're hiding the ball from what they should be focused on to focus on something else, which they should also be focused on. But to me, those two concerns, one, are people focused on their job, which is to maximize returns as an investor, and two, are individuals in question making sure that they're telling the full story. Those are legitimate things that people raise concerns about. And then here's the last one. Do investors know what they're getting into? So part of why this debate occurred was there was an argument that there was proxy voting in a way that the individuals that ultimately made the underlying investment in the manager that was doing the proxy voting weren't involved in. We're very clear. Everybody that invests in our global impact strategy understands what we're trying to do, how we're trying to do it, how we're going to govern. So those three things: maximize returns, number one, make sure you're not greenwashing, number two, and make sure you're very transparent with investors so that they know what they're getting. If you do those three things, I've talked to the reddest of elected officials and the bluest of elected officials, and they all seem to think that makes sense.
That's what you were always good at, is bringing folks together. So let me ask this then: is the initiative that KKR is pursuing, that I know the Silicon Valley's done for a while, to ensure employee ownerships across all the companies you're invested in, is that part of the impact fund? Is that separate from what the impact fund's doing? I mean, I remember reading something, you probably sent me the story, that sounded exciting, and it felt very much like Silicon Valley, which I participated in, although because of the tech bubble, I did not profit from.
Well, it's the brainchild and the leadership of one of my partners, Pete Stavros, who's a wonderful guy. Pete broadly is the co-head of private equity around the world. And Pete grew up in a house where his dad was a machinist. And his dad would come home from work every day. And explain his frustration that it seemed like management didn't really understand how the business really operated and didn't really care how a guy like him thought about it. And when Pete was at Harvard Business School, he studied this process, studied ESOP, studied other ways. And when he came to KKR, he built and led our industrials business. And we had a company about 11 years ago that was having a huge problem with quit rate. And if you talk to almost any CEO, you deal with CEOs all the time, one of the biggest challenges we've got today is how do you keep your employees engaged and how do you keep them from leaving? It's a huge problem today. And so Pete thought back to his Harvard Business School days and his dad's example, and he said, let's try something. Let's try providing employees with real stock ownership in addition to their salary. And let's also provide them with real voice in how the company's operating. And the result was the quit rate massively declined. Something we've now done, we do it in much of the impact fund. It started and it is led by Pete, as I said, our co-head of global private equity, where we're working to across every business we have, optimize and measure employee engagement. And one tool that we've now used at more than 30 companies with more than 50,000 employees is this tool of giving employees meaningful stock ownership, meaningful voice in the company. And the third point's important, financial literacy. Because that literacy is important to understand. Yeah, you're going to get a dividend sometimes, or you may have a stock certificate, but don't go out and buy a car tomorrow. Here's what it's really worth, and here's how to think about it. And the second reason that financial literacy is so critical is for them to understand how a profit is made is how we improve the productivity of a company. Pete loves to tell the story. We used to own a company called CHI Garage Door. It makes garage doors. And it's a business that when we bought it, people were like, what can they do to improve the business? It's been owned by private equity firms 3 different times. Why are they buying this business? And the reason we bought it was because Pete's thesis around employee engagement, he thought would produce a differentiated outcome. We made 10 times our money. One of our most successful investments ever. And the story that Pete loves to tell is Pete spends a lot of time at the company. And he was once driving with a gentleman whose job it was to drive a large truck and deliver the garage door and then install it at the home of the people that had purchased it. And the guy was paid by the mile he drove. And he came back to Pete and he said, Pete, I'm making more money because you're having me go from central Illinois, where the company's located, to Wisconsin today, back to central Illinois, and then tomorrow to Minnesota. But the truth is, I'm now a stockholder in the company. That's not efficient. Why don't we have a more efficient routing process by which I stay overnight at a motel or sleep in the truck and go to both places? That mindset, imagine that mindset thousands of times in a company, and that's the power of this app. So the reason this effort was put forward was to improve the company's operations, its productivity, its safety, reduce its quit rate, and it also has these other benefits too. And it's something I'm really proud of.
All right. Well, it seems like you should be, and I get the impact there. Let me ask you about something else within KKR before we turn to other topics. One of the things that happened while you've been there is the creation of the KKR Global Institute, led by the great General David Petraeus, who's an American hero in lots of ways, not least because he's been kind enough to also appear on the Zoom that we put together. But he did a lot of other good stuff too, so I should probably prioritize. What's the purpose of the Institute? And when you do something that at least from the outside feels a little think tanky, how do you measure its impact?
So the purpose of the Institute, when we brought Dave in, was we thought there were 2 big things that were important for us to understand. One was we believed at the time, this was 10 years ago, that we were seeing increased geopolitical tension, and that's increased even more now. So if you think about most of the time that most people on this call have worked, we lived in a world of essentially benign globalization. That's moved to a period of geopolitical rivalry. And if you can understand those geopolitics and what they mean, you're going to make fewer mistakes and you're going to do better as investors. So partly because of the thinking of the Institute, partly because of another of my partners, Johannes Huth, who leads our European business, we made a decision, it was very different than a lot of other people. About 10 years ago, we weren't going to invest in companies based in Russia because we fundamentally believed that the risks involved, which were risks you couldn't control, were too great. So one, Dave helps us see around the corner and understand and manage these geopolitical questions. And the second is another big thesis we have is the security of everything, right? So when you see companies willing to pay, whether it be around cybersecurity, supply chain security, we've as a firm put $10.5 billion to work in defense-related businesses, cybersecurity-related businesses, and supply chain-related security businesses in the last 15 years. Dave knows something about that. So Dave and his colleagues help us in this space, both identify opportunities and make investments. And so when we started, my advice to Dave was, I said, your job is not to be interesting, it's to be useful. Because interesting is the think tank risk, right? Interesting is the risk that it's thought leadership, but thought leadership doesn't pay the bills. What pays the bills is putting capital to work in smart companies and making them worth more. So how do you make everything you do useful? And Dave, along with two gentlemen he brought in, Van Serchuk and Neil Brown, are rock stars. They're really smart, and they are incredibly great colleagues for the firm. And they've been wonderful, wonderful people for me to learn from.
Well, he's interesting too, but that's good.
Yeah.
A good admonition for him. So, look, you obviously come from the world of politics initially. That was your first career. Many of us who are still toiling away in the policy and politics world wonder whether we have skills that and learnings that have much value outside of Washington. What did you find that your time as in politics and in campaigns and in governance, what were the learnings that you were able to then apply in the world of finance and the world of impact investing and otherwise helped you not reset and restart, but to take it from where you left off and go up?
Yeah, I think you do have skills that are very useful, very translatable. And if you think about it again, what is the underlying content? So think about what Madden and I and others did between the end of early 2003 till the end of 2004. While we was a presidential campaign whose business was politics, fundamentally, we started from scratch an enterprise that would raise and spend about $1 billion, that would, if you look at both direct employees and indirect employees, you'd have 2,000 people you had responsibility for, that was on the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post every single day, often in the course of a crisis, and that would motivate 2 million people to take time out of their busy schedules to volunteer and help. So what is the content you gain from when you do that? One is politics and political understanding, to be sure. Second, crisis management. Everybody on this call is an expert in crisis management in a way that I always joke, everybody says KKR is so busy. I'm the only guy that came here whose world slowed down a little bit compared to what I was used to. But crisis management and the importance, I would say, of scenario planning, of planning ahead, of prepping to help make sure you can anticipate and be your best when the crisis happens. That's one thing. The second, I think, is how do you motivate people? Like, that's a really big deal. So at KKR or in your company or other places, you can give people a nice bonus, or you give them some stock. In a political campaign, you're asking people who are really talented to get paid not a lot of money, to work crazy hours, to fly in the back of a unpleasant plane or bus, to be 2 or 3 people in a motel together, and to do that for 2 years, not knowing if you're going to win. So how do you get people to be motivated in that environment, and what can you learn about it? What I learned about motivating people are a few things. Obviously, the cause of George W. Bush in 2004 was motivating, but there's also a motivation you get from being part of something that's larger than yourself. So I was obsessive, and Kevin will tell you this, about constantly reminding every single person at the campaign what our strategy was, so that they all felt like they were critical participants. Second, universal KPIs. KPIs that everybody could understand and everybody could measure and everyone could participate in. 3, as much as possible, eschew hierarchy. So a lot of campaigns, there's like an ego hall where all the top people in the campaign sit. Opposite of that, I was campaign manager. I sat among junior people. Other colleagues sat in other places around the campaign. That was really important. And finally, I think, and I would argue the most important thing I learned about motivating people is you motivate people based on behavior, not status. And so when Air Force One lands in Columbus, Ohio, the governor is not the first person to greet President Bush. The first person is the woman that knocked on the most doors. The home that the fundraiser is having is not the person that was once ambassador under his dad. It's the person that raised the most money. So if you create a world where people are incentivized, not based on their status, but based on what they do, it's amazing what happens and how people are motivated. And I would argue that the people that are most important to motivate aren't the people at the top. They're the most junior people. So that when George Bush shows up at the office, the intern greets him. And the person that's the volunteer that does the most gets a call from Air Force One. All those things were important lessons that I learned. And then the last is the growth mindset, right? Like, I think the growth mindset that politics, which is incredibly humbling, forces you to have, is incredibly powerful. We lost the popular vote in 2000. I had a whole lot of colleagues who's like making excuses. This is why it happened or didn't. I said, that's the wrong answer. We're going to learn from it. And we created an effort called the 72-hour effort that focused on the last 72 hours of the campaign. That effort, which studied in a very scientific way, every way to engage with voters, produced the outcome in 2004. It taught us about that micro-targeting we developed. Similarly, is there media bias? I believe the mainstream media tends to lean left. So what does that mean? We've all got to be as articulate as Madden when we're on television. That's what it means. And
Good Lord.
Kevin will remember this. When people complained about media bias, I had a jury I had to put money in. I used to say to people, we have to run a 5-minute mile. They have to run a 6-minute mile. If you don't want to learn to run a 5-minute mile, don't work here. But the point is, the challenges we have in life, and politics is so challenging, make us so much more effective because we learn to adapt. So to me, they're the biggest. Growth mindset and learning to adapt, learning to motivate others in a way that's really powerful, and learning how to anticipate and thereby be able to deal with, in the most effective way you can, crises.
Well, they're all powerful, although I believe your list of 3 included 6 if I was scoring at home properly, but they're all good. So let me ask you this, Ken, besides, I get the people piece and the mission piece. There's also a lot of tools and tactics. And you mentioned micro-targeting. And one of the things that the 04 campaign was famous for was Moneyball, or Moneyball in politics, the idea of seeing how the cutting edge businesses didn't aim broadly, but aim narrowly and specifically and with focus. The tools and tech. Well, first of all, maybe just start with, do you think that led to a winning politics? Do you think fast forward 20 years that leads to a healthy politics?
I think it is, because so I just to reinforce Bruce's point, I made everyone read Moneyball. That was the one book I made everyone read. I actually talked about it. Billy Beane saw it, reached out to me, and Billy Beane came and spoke to all of us. The main character in Moneyball, great guy, really interesting individual. And the 2 lessons of Moneyball that I wanted people to take, which I think any enterprise you ever do are critical. The first is the importance of metrics, the importance of having real metrics and making decisions based on metrics. And the second, life is not won and campaigns are not won by hitting home runs. Remember the insight that the metrics taught Billy Beane and his colleagues, which was the best baseball players didn't look like Billy Beane looked, who was tall and fast and really strong. They were guys that could read pitchers and get on base. And so fundamentally, the most important lesson is life is about repeatedly being able to get on base. It's about recurring incremental successes that if you repeat, it creates the power of compounding. And those were the 2 lessons I wanted people to understand. I wanted people to understand that success was not from like the giant big insight that's going to change everything. And that's how we learn politics. It's instead every single day doing a little bit better than the day before. If you can improve by 1% each week, whatever it is you're doing, whether it's winning a presidential election or whatever you're doing in business or running a marathon, you're going to be in a successful way of operating. And to do that, you need metrics and the power that Billy Beane learned about the ability to get on base.
So take it forward then. We're in the 2020s. For social entrepreneurs or others looking to drive change, whether it's a political cause or a market movement, I know you have some thoughts about the need to sort of cross train, and it's no longer simply who's either good at counting votes or who's good at media. You need to be able to leverage a lot of tools and hit to a lot of fields. Sort of running an integrated campaign. What are your thoughts on what is needed to be most effective as an activist or a social entrepreneur? And is anybody teaching it in a unified way?
Yeah. So there are 2 books I always encourage people that are interested in social progress or interested in improving the world to read. And the 2 books are books you and I have discussed before. One is a book called The Honor Code. And The Honor Code is a book that studies how does social change occur. And 2 examples. So for years, people made the case that the Atlantic slave trade was barbaric and brutal and horrible to its victims. What caused in England a sudden mindset change where it went from being something that was acceptable to unacceptable? Similarly, in China, the binding of women's feet was something that for years happened, and suddenly it became unacceptable. And what the author finds when he studies the change is that it wasn't that there suddenly became a different view with respect to its victims. There wasn't suddenly empathy, but rather the dominant societal group or the dominant way of thinking became convinced it was inconsistent with their conception of honor. And so if you really want to change the world and you want to change someone else's mindset, learn how they think and make the case on their terms. That's something we spent a bunch of time doing around marriage equality, for example, where we thought about it from the perspective of people who previously had not been persuaded. The majority had been inconsistent with where we were, and we explained it to them in a way we thought would be consistent with their values. The second book that you and I have spoken, I think you may have interviewed one of the authors, is New Power. And what it explains is we've moved from a world where, when I was running the campaign to some extent, certainly 20 years before, power was thought of as currency. So if you had a lot of money to run ads, you had currency. And if you had a lot of money to hire a big field organization, you had currency. And what today power comes from is a current. The ability to say something or put something up. It could be on YouTube. It could be on TikTok. It could be on other social media that captures people's attention, that's edgy, that's interesting, that's inspiring, that suddenly spreads like a wave. So to me, the two things you need to think about are, one, how do you make the case on other people's terms? And two, equally importantly, how do you make that case in other people's terms in a way that, in a world where people have so much information coming at them, it's going to be sticky and memorable, and it'll spread like wildfire.
So you mentioned the marriage equality fight. Drill down on specifically in that fight. What did you and others do to help put this on terms of people who weren't on board to help get us to where we had 61 votes in the Senate last Congress?
Well, I was fortunate I was a volunteer, and I got to work with a lot of amazing, really smart people like Tim Gill and others that I learned a lot from. But I think the central insight was that a couple things. One, you needed to make the case on marriage equality on the grounds that were fundamentally conservative. And so marriage equality became the freedom to marry. If you believe in limited government, if you want to limit the power of the state and let people have optimal freedom in their lives, they ought to be able to choose the person that they want to marry if they love that person. Second, family values. For years, the argument about family values was made against marriage equality. We flipped it. We said, if you value families and you believe in family values, why are you preventing families from forming? And so the kind of social conservative argument for marriage equality we made. Third, constitutionalism. We got people like Ted Olson and others, and we drafted amicus briefs that made the case in terms that were consistent with conservative thinking with respect to the Constitution. So, for example, the court had for years argued marriage, the person who you choose to marry, was a fundamental right. And similarly, in our more recent success, which involved the prevention of people from being fired from their jobs based on being gay or transgender, we argued, using a Scalia argument that he had argued in a different case, that if you read the text of Title VII and you're treating people, which prohibits discrimination based on a person's gender, and you're treating Ken and Kendra differently in the exact same situation, which is we have a picture of our husband on our desk, then you're violating the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, a decision that Justice Gorsuch, who is obviously a textualist, agreed with, and the Chief Justice signed on to a 6-3 decision. So we looked at different moments. There were Supreme Court cases. There was the recent legislation that was put forward that we were able to provide support for. There were state initiatives where there were state ballot votes. And in each of those contexts, we made sure that the case was made on both progressive grounds and conservative grounds from people that had credibility with conservatives. And we found that that had a real persuasive effect.
All right. You talked about putting the arguments in terms of optimizing freedom, constraining the power of the state. I would say that's core to the GOP and conservative mindset in the era of Ronald Reagan. Several of these ago, I had Matthew Continetti, a great author and journalist who wrote a book. I think I sent it to you, called The Right. It's really thoughtful. Yeah, it's the 100-Year War for American Conservatism. I'm not sure that optimizing freedom and constraining the power of the state defines necessarily modern conservatism as much. I mean, in a world where they're going to call Liz Cheney a rhino, the daughter of Darth Vader, who's one of the most conservative people we both knew, it feels like we're in a bit of a free fall, although some of it maybe reflects, and I think a lot of it reflects the rising global and national populism, and maybe a little bit of a concern about social values and whether things are changing too fast. What do you see as the defining trends in American politics right now, and where do you see them heading?
So I think your decks do a fantastic job of laying them out. And one that you laid out a number of years ago, or probably 2 years ago, the idea that we're living through a second Gilded Age. So if you study the period of the late 1800s, several things were happening at once in the United States. One, there was rapid industrialization that was taking what was largely an agricultural economy and world and making it an urban economy and world. And people felt and were being essentially dispossessed of where they lived, where they worked, et cetera. Second, the country's demographic was changing massively because of increasing immigration from Southern and Central and Eastern Europe. And third, people were getting information from new sources because of the rise of a new kind of media that William Randolph Hearst really did a very good job of popularizing and expanding. Every one of those trends is true today. And on top of that, you have the effect of internet and social media, which I think is as consequential and probably more consequential than any of the others. And so we're going through this period of incredible change. And let's be honest, while I love Ronald Reagan, you love Ronald Reagan, we were inspired by Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was elected president 40 years ago. He was solving different problems than the problems we have today. So to me, what I hope our movement can be for is how do we reform government in a way that produces the outcomes whereby people, through hard work, are able to rise. So there's nothing more critical than, for example, education reform. And how do we take the technological changes we have today in a way so that people can, both when they're young, but throughout their lives, learn in a way that helps them be able to seize the opportunities they ought to be able to have. That's one. Two, we need to recognize also, again, in a different world than the world we lived in 40 years ago today, that there were a lot of people in a lot of places that were left behind. And while globalization produced efficiency, which is a good thing, there are a whole lot of places in Ohio and West Virginia and Pennsylvania that were essentially really gutted out from an economic and a social perspective. How do we address that? And I actually think there's an opportunity as we reshore, because of geopolitical concerns, to rebuild manufacturing in those spaces in a way that can be interesting. To do that, what should we be for? Obviously, I think a tax code that promotes innovation and that promotes investment and that promotes growth. So we should still be the party of economic growth. The party of peace through strength, obviously, is critically important, and the party of reform. And if we do those things, I think we're rewarded. But we can't just look back and say, hey, President Reagan won 44 and 49 states. We're going to do the same thing today, any more than in the 80s, Democrats could say we're the party of FDR, because that was a different era and a different generation. So how do we take the philosophy, which is about less government, it is about maximizing personal freedom, it is about peace through strength, it ought to be about respecting others, and apply it to the world that we live in today?
You've been generous with your time, which is otherwise very expensive. I know. I'll hit you with one last one, just more on personal, and I know from Thanksgiving you have plenty to say on lots of other topics, but more just even on more broadly, who are some heroes of yours over that you've gotten to work with or that you've read about and learned about? Maybe pick three, and let's just start as an assumed I was one of them. I'm taking myself off the table. I'm out of the running. You can't pick me. Pick three heroes that aren't me.
So first, and they're not just because they're on the call, but I think to both of us, our parents are heroes for a lot of reasons. First, their example of what total commitment is in their relationship is something that is amazing and is incredibly not just great as a kid to grow up because of the security it gives, but as an example for your whole life and how one can be totally reliable, totally focused, and totally loving. So that's a huge one. And if you've got that in your life, then you're in a good place. I would say, obviously not a person I ever met, but Nelson Mandela to me is someone I always have had huge admiration for, because not only was he an incredible patriot, so if you think about what he did to bring his country together at a time that was really hard, but what he showed about the power of grace and forgiveness in really helping to solve really big problems and provide an example, to me, is there's no one I can think of that has such an example, at least in the modern world. This past week, I was really fortunate. I'm on the board, as you know, of an organization called SEO, Sponsored Educational Opportunity. We focus on helping young people that have high potential, but the education system is failing. And we help them with additional both learning outside of the classroom, as well as mentoring, both to get into college, succeed in college, and then ultimately succeed in life. And the people involved in that are unbelievable heroes. The average family income of a New York family whose child is part of SEO in New York is less than $35,000 a year. I had an SEO mentee for a number of years named Josh. His family was homeless for a period of time. And the challenges these young people face and their families face is incredible. And guess what they choose to do? They choose to spend their whole Saturday, 2 nights a week, and the whole month of July in classrooms, getting massive additional training in math and in reading. And then when they go to college, they say, I'm going to have a mentor, some pain like Ken, who's going to give me advice on what courses to take and what not to put on social media and all that. And they have all that because they want to be successful. And yet many of these young people come from an environment where they don't have role models of people that have the opportunities we have, or that understand the power of work in the sense of we understand it. And they often are in communities where there's tremendous violence and where there's disruption. And yet every single day they go to work to try to make themselves and their community better. And so they're heroes, and the people involved in that are heroes. There's a guy named Michael Oshwitz. He started SEO in 1963. I got invited to his 80th birthday party a few years ago. It was awesome. And the place was full of guys his age and young people from SEO and everybody in between. William Goodlow, who runs the effort, is a hero and an amazing guy. And the chairman of it is my partner and the CEO of the founder of our firm, Henry Kravis, who, in addition to being a philanthropic and business goat, is also someone who has been unbelievably active at SEO, spending huge amounts of time. So SEO is one example, but I think that people who are involved in helping other people unlock and realize potential, because through no fault of those individuals' own, they were raised in a different place than I was raised and you were raised, they're heroes. And there are millions of them around the country. And the young people that face, and their parents, who face these challenges and yet say, I'm not going to in any way let it reduce what I think I can achieve and how I can work. Those people are huge heroes to me. And you don't know about them, you don't read about them, they're not famous, but I think they, in some ways, may be the biggest heroes.
All right, so I lied. I'm going to ask one last, but it'll be an easier one, which is you're famous for a second act. You went from top of politics to pretty darn well up in finance and private equity. If somebody required you at age 60, which is in the distance, but not that much in the distance, that said you had to leave, no choice. You've got to leave Wall Street and finance. You've got to leave, and you can't return to politics. What would be your third act?
Well, I'd want to study the space before, for sure, answering your question. But I would say that space would probably be around some of the examples I gave around things like SEO or Teach for America. So helping to support and help accelerate organizations that are focused through mission and purpose on economic opportunity and mobility. And I think there's a lot of examples of that. Dad and I have talked a lot about this. Certainly the prison reentry space is amazingly interesting to me. Think about this. If you're in California and you're a prisoner, when there are forest fires, they make you go out and fight the forest fires and put yourself at risk. And when you leave prison, having served your time and return to the community, you can't be a fireman or firewoman. You can't serve in the fire department because that's not allowed. And we have these rules that are so obviously unfair, on top of a criminal justice system that is so, in my opinion, skewed based on what assets people have, that I think that opportunity is a big one. But I do think the idea of, if you believe, which I do a lot, in second acts and second chances, what's a more important second chance than helping people that made a mistake be in a place where the most important thing in their life is not the worst mistake they made? And I think that's an area of real interest.
Ken, it's always great to see you. I'm looking forward to seeing you at a family event this weekend. But thanks for making time with a lot of your friends, and you have many, many admirers, as you know. I know a lot of people are going to be disappointed at me for not exploring the destruction of the Volvo in 1984, which most upsettingly, Dad, when I talked with him in advance of this, misremembered. He thought I totaled the damn car, and you broke lots of cars. I was always good to my car.
Great things I learned as a kid, which was very helpful in politics, was to deflect blame to you. And it's something I hope to continue to do for many, many years. But thank you. Appreciate it. Awesome to see so many friends. And most importantly, happy birthday, Bruce Mehlman.
Thank you, Ken. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.